AITA for canceling my wedding after my fiancée secretly reconnected with her affair partner? I'm Benjamin, 36, and Sophie is 34. When this happened, we had been together for a little over 6 years and engaged for 14 months. Our wedding was 2 months away. If you had asked me even a few weeks earlier whether I trusted her, I would have said yes without a second thought. That wasn't because our relationship had always been easy. About 3 years into our relationship, Sophie cheated on me with Luke, a guy she had dated before we met. I want to be clear about what happened because it's crucial to everything that came later. Luke wasn't just some ex whose name made me insecure. Sophie and Luke had been together for about 2 years before she met me. Their breakup had been messy, and while she always told me she was over him, she later admitted there was still something about him that made her feel connected to an older version of herself. They ran into each other at a gathering of people Sophie knew before me. They started messaging afterward. Sophie told me later that she liked how familiar it felt. She liked being wanted by someone who remembered her before the life she had with me. Then they slept together once. 2 days later, Sophie told me, "I didn't catch her. I didn't see a suspicious text, get a call from a friend, or piece together a story from missing hours. She sat me down and told me what she had done before I even knew there was anything to look for. That was one of the reasons I stayed. It wasn't enough on its own. I moved out for several weeks because I couldn't be in the apartment without feeling like every ordinary thing had become fake. We talked constantly during that time, but not in the clean, productive way people sometimes describe reconciliation. We repeated ourselves. I asked the same questions more than once. She answered some things badly. I got quiet when I should have just said I was angry. There were days when I thought I was going back and days when I thought I never would. But Sophie did something important then. She didn't tell me I was overreacting. She didn't call it a mistake and ask me to move on. She said she had made a decision that could end our relationship and understood that she didn't get to control whether I could live with it. At one point, when we were talking about what trying again would actually require, she said, "No more deciding for you what you can handle. If there's something hard, I tell you. You decide what you do with it." I remembered that sentence for years because at the time it sounded like the difference between confession and concealment. One of the conditions I gave her if we were going to try again was simple. Luke was completely out. No private messages. No coffee. No checking in on birthdays. No casual friendship built around the idea that everything was fine now. No keeping him in the background while I tried to decide if I could trust her again. Sophie agreed. I didn't frame it as a life sentence. I also didn't say we would revisit it on some schedule. At the time, neither of us was thinking in terms of 3 years or 5 years from now. I was thinking about whether I could sleep in the same bed with her again. She was thinking about whether I was going to leave. For a long time, it seemed like the agreement worked. She cut contact with Luke. We rebuilt our routines. Eventually, I stopped asking questions. I stopped noticing when she left her phone on the couch because it no longer meant anything. I stopped mentally comparing her plans to the clock. I became proud of the fact that I no longer needed reassurance. In hindsight, that pride was part of the problem. I started measuring our recovery by how rarely we had to talk about what had happened. The affair became a closed room in our relationship. We knew it existed. We had both been inside it. We just stopped opening the door. About 2 years after the affair, I proposed. It mattered to me that I proposed after enough time had passed that I no longer felt like I was trying to prove something. I wasn't offering marriage as a reward for good behavior. I genuinely believed we had rebuilt something stable. I knew what she had done, she knew I knew, and I thought we were choosing each other with the ugly part included. For 14 months, being engaged mostly felt normal. There were guest lists, family opinions, seating charts, and things we postponed until we absolutely had to decide. There was also the occasional argument about whether some tiny wedding detail was worth caring about. A few weeks before everything blew up, Sophie started saying things that seemed unrelated at the time. One night she mentioned that some of the old crowd had started hanging out again. She said it while scrolling through her phone and didn't name anyone. I assumed she meant people from the period before we met. Her old social circles had always overlapped in ways I didn't fully understand, so I didn't ask much about it. Another time, we were talking about something completely different when she asked if I thought people could be permanently defined by one terrible thing they had done. I remember saying, "Depends on what they did and what they did afterward." She said, "That sounds like yes with extra steps." I laughed a little because I thought she was making a general point. Then we moved on. A week or so later, we changed one person on the guest list, and Sophie joked that the wedding was turning into a referendum on everyone we've ever had history with. Again, I didn't think much of it. Weddings make people weird about old friendships, old grudges, and family politics. I thought that was all she meant. Holly, Sophie's closest friend and one of the people in the wedding party, came over one afternoon to help us with some final planning details. At one point she asked Sophie, "Did you sort out that awkward situation yet?" Sophie immediately said, "We're still figuring out the seating thing," and started talking about two other guests who didn't get along. I accepted the redirect because there actually was a seating issue involving those guests. A few days after that, Sophie said she wanted us to stop living like certain people are radioactive. That one stayed with me a little longer. I asked, "Who are we talking about?" She said, "Nobody specific. I just mean in general." I told her I didn't think we lived that way. She gave me a look that suggested she disagreed, but didn't explain. Then came the night of the guest list conversation. We were at the dining table with a spreadsheet open, trying to finalize a handful of remaining decisions. Sophie had been unusually quiet for a few minutes, then said, "There's someone I want to add." I asked who. "Before you react, I want you to hear why." That was when I looked up from the screen. There are names that can enter a room before the person does. Luke's was one of them. I said, "Who?" She took a breath. "Luke." I thought I had misunderstood her. Luke. "Yes. The Luke you cheated on me with." Her mouth tightened. "I knew you were going to phrase it like that." I almost laughed, but nothing about it was funny. How else would I phrase it? As someone from my past. Someone I've known a long time. He's not just someone from your past. I know that. Do you? She pushed her chair back a few inches. "I don't want our wedding to be built around pretending the past didn't happen." I said, "That's an interesting way to describe inviting him." She looked frustrated before we had even really started. "This is exactly what I mean. He has this enormous symbolic power in our relationship because you still treat him like he's radioactive." That word again. I asked, "Why would he even expect an invitation?" She hesitated, and it was just long enough to change the question in my head. "When did you start thinking about Luke again?" She said, "That's not the point. That wasn't my question. I'm trying to talk to you about where we are now." "Then answer me from where we are now. Why is Luke suddenly relevant enough to be on our wedding guest list?" Sophie leaned back and rubbed her forehead. "Because I've realized I don't want to enter a marriage where one person from my past is permanently forbidden. We're adults. It's been years. I'm not asking you to be friends with him. You're asking me to have him at our wedding. I'm asking whether we're actually healed or if we've just been avoiding this forever." I said nothing for a few seconds. Then she gave me the line that I have replayed more times than I care to admit. "If we're really healed, you won't make this a problem." I became very calm. Not peaceful, just calm in that way your mind stops trying to keep up with your emotions because something about the conversation has become too strange. I said, "Then invite him." Sophie blinked. "What? If that's what you need, invite him." She studied my face, maybe trying to decide if I was being sarcastic. I closed the spreadsheet. She said, "Benjamin, I'm not trying to hurt you." I didn't say you were. "You're acting weird." "I'm tired." That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I was also trying not to turn the conversation into an interrogation before I knew what I was asking. We stopped talking about the guest list. The next morning, while we were cleaning up after breakfast, I asked her, "When was the last time you spoke to Luke?" She paused with a mug in her hand. "I saw him with some people a few weeks ago." That was not what I had expected. I said, "You saw him?" "Yes. A group thing." "Did you know he would be there?" "I knew he might be." "Did you talk to him?" She set the mug down a little harder than necessary. "Obviously. I wasn't going to pretend he was invisible." "Did you talk after that?" This is exactly what I was afraid of. "What is?" One name, and suddenly we're back 3 years. You're asking questions like I'm on trial. I asked if you talked to him. I'm talking to you about our wedding and our future, and you're trying to drag me backward. I could feel myself starting to get angry, but the older fear underneath it bothered me more. I said, "Did you communicate with him after you saw him?" She crossed the kitchen and picked up her phone from the counter. "We should talk later when you're not doing this." "Doing what?" "Interrogating me." Then she left the room. I stood there for another minute and considered following her. I didn't. Part of that was self-control. Part of it was avoidance. I knew the version of me from 3 years earlier, the one who needed every answer immediately, and I did not want to become that person again. I had spent a long time being proud that I no longer checked, pressed, or repeated questions. So I let the conversation end even though she hadn't answered me. Later that day, Sophie came back with a more thought-out argument. She said the original no-contact agreement had made sense when everything was raw. She said she had accepted it because she understood I needed safety and predictability. But years had passed, and she was tired of feeling like one person from her history had to be permanently banned for our relationship to function. I'm not asking for some close friendship, she said. I'm saying I don't want to walk into marriage with rules we made during the worst month of our lives. I told her I understood that more than she probably thought. And I did. I could imagine how humiliating it must have been to know there was a person on earth whose very name could still be treated as evidence against you. I could understand wanting to believe that if I had truly forgiven her, Luke would eventually become emotionally neutral. I could even understand resenting a rule she had accepted when she had very little bargaining power, because she was the one asking me not to leave. I said, "You could have told me you wanted to revisit it. I'm telling you now." That sentence landed strangely, not because of what she said, but because of the tense. "I'm telling you now." I asked, "Have you been talking to him?" She looked at me with the exhausted expression of someone being asked the same unfair question again. "We had a conversation." "What does that mean?" "It means we talked. By message. At first." At first. She threw her hands up. "See? This is why I didn't want to get into every tiny detail before we could talk about the larger point." I stared at her. She seemed to hear what she had just said. "Before?" I asked. She looked away. That was the moment I knew there was more to it, but I still didn't know what. The answer came the next afternoon from Holly. She came by because there were a few wedding-related things she and Sophie had planned to finish together. I was home, and I considered making myself scarce because Sophie and I were barely speaking normally. Instead, Holly walked into a situation she did not understand. Sophie had clearly told her some version of our argument. I knew that because Holly was more careful with me than usual, the way people are when they have been briefed that someone is upset. We made awkward small talk for a few minutes. Sophie said she needed to grab something from another room and left Holly and me at the table. Holly glanced toward the hallway, then said, "For what it's worth, I get why the wedding part feels weird." I looked at her. She continued, "I just don't think the coffee itself was a big deal. I was there the first time." I said, "What coffee?" Holly froze. It was immediate. No performance, no scrambling for an excuse. Her face changed because she realized I genuinely did not know what she was talking about. She said, "Wait. What coffee, Holly?" "I thought she told you." "About what?" She looked toward the hallway again. I said, "Please don't protect me from information about my own relationship." She exhaled and lowered her voice. "A few of us got coffee a few weeks ago. Luke was there. Did Sophie know he was going to be there?" "I think she knew he might come. I don't know if it was planned around him." "Did they talk?" "Yes, but everyone was there." I nodded. Then I asked, "You said the first time." Holly went very still. "What was the second time?" She said, "You need to ask Sophie. That means there was a second time. I shouldn't be in the middle of this." "You're not. I'm asking what I'm already clearly supposed to know." Holly rubbed her fingers against the edge of a folder on the table. "She told me they talked once after. Just the two of them. Coffee, I think. She said they wanted to clear the air. I heard Sophie coming back." Holly looked miserable. Before Sophie reached the room, I asked one more question. "Did Sophie tell you I knew?" Holly nodded automatically, then seemed to realize why I was asking. "Yes," she said. "She said you knew she'd seen him again. She said you were past all of that." Sophie walked in holding a stack of papers. Holly stopped speaking. I didn't confront Sophie in front of her. I don't know if that was restraint or shock. I just sat there while they finished what they were doing, barely hearing a thing. At some point, Sophie asked me if I was okay. I said, "I'm fine." Holly looked at me and then at Sophie. Nobody believed me. When Holly left, I closed the door behind her and turned around. "How many times have you seen Luke?" Sophie's shoulders dropped. Benjamin. How many? Twice. Group coffee and once alone? Yes. For how long? The second one? Yes. Maybe 20 minutes. In public? Yes. I said, why are you telling me that? Because I know where your mind is going. You don't. You think I cheated again. I'm not accusing you of another affair. She stopped. I said, I'm asking why you broke the one agreement that made me stay. Her expression changed from defensive to angry. Because that agreement was made 3 years ago when everything was on fire. And I am not the same person I was then. Neither are you. At least I thought you weren't. That doesn't answer why you hid it. I didn't tell you because I knew this is exactly what would happen. What is happening? You're treating coffee like sex. No, I'm treating lying like lying. I didn't lie to you about sleeping with him because I didn't sleep with him. That is not the only possible lie in a relationship. She walked away from me, then turned back. You have no idea what it has felt like to live with this permanent exception. You say you forgave me. You proposed to me. You tell everyone we got through it. But Luke still has this huge power over us. I can see someone from my own past for 20 minutes, and suddenly everything we built is gone. I said, you're the one who made seeing him something you had to hide. Because I knew you wouldn't hear me. You never tried. I'm trying now. No. Now you're trying to invite him to our wedding after you already saw him. She flinched a little at that. I asked, why did you tell Holly I knew? Sophie said nothing. I waited. She said, because I didn't want everyone acting like I was doing something wrong. But you knew I hadn't agreed. I knew what you'd say. That sentence did more damage than the coffee. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean the logic of the situation changed right there. Until then, I was still arguing with myself about whether the old no-contact agreement had become unreasonable without either of us acknowledging it. Maybe Sophie had a point. Maybe a crisis boundary should not automatically become a lifetime rule. Maybe my pride in never discussing Luke had left no room for her to say that the agreement no longer worked for her. But telling Holly I knew was different. She hadn't simply crossed a boundary she thought was outdated. She had fabricated my approval. You told her I agreed because you knew I wouldn't, I said. That's not what I said. You literally just said you knew what I'd say. I knew you'd have an emotional reaction before you thought about it. So you thought for me. Oh my God, Benjamin. No, explain it. I was working up to telling you. When it made sense. It would have made sense before you met him alone. She looked away. I said, did Luke think I knew too? That question made her pause. I asked again, did you tell Luke I knew? I told him we were okay. That isn't what I asked. She exhaled sharply. I said you knew we'd run into each other. Did you tell him I knew you were messaging? I don't remember exactly how I phrased it. That answer was enough to tell me I probably wasn't going to get clarity while we were both in that room. I packed an overnight bag. Sophie followed me down the hallway asking where I was going. I said, Mara's. You're leaving over this? I'm leaving for one night because I don't want to decide anything while we're fighting. She said, that sounds like deciding something. It isn't. Are you coming back tomorrow? Yes. Are you canceling the wedding? I looked at her. I said I'm not deciding tonight. She stood in the doorway while I zipped the bag. For a second, she looked more scared than angry, and it brought me straight back to the weeks after the affair. That made leaving harder than I expected. I still left. Mara is my older sister. She's 39, and she has the useful quality of not turning every family crisis into a speech. When I got there, she opened the door, looked at my bag, and said, that bad? I said, maybe. She asked if I had eaten. I hadn't. She put food in front of me and waited until I started explaining. I told her the sequence as clearly as I could. Luke on the guest list, the evasive answers, Holly's coffee comment, the private meeting, and Sophie telling Holly I knew. Mara did not tell me to leave Sophie. She asked, do you think she cheated again? No. Do you think she's planning to? I don't know, but I don't have evidence of that. And that's not really what's bothering me. What is? She ended the agreement on her own. Then she told other people I was on board with it. Mara nodded. I told her Sophie's argument too, that the boundary was old, that I had never created a real way to revisit it, that maybe I had benefited from pretending reconciliation meant we never had to discuss Luke again. Mara said, "That can all be true." I waited for more. She took a drink of water and said, "If you had known all this 6 months ago, would you still have proposed?" I started to answer, then realized the timeline didn't fit. I'd already proposed. "Fine," she said. "Then forget the proposal. If you knew this now and the wedding was 6 months away instead of 2, would you still be trying to marry her?" I stared at the table. Mara said, "I'm not asking whether you still love her." That was the only part she emphasized. "I'm asking what you think you're agreeing to now." I slept badly on her couch. The next morning, I still did not know exactly what I was going to do. Then Luke messaged me. I hadn't spoken to him in years. I didn't have his number saved anymore, so when the message appeared, it took me a moment to realize who it was. He kept it short. He said he had heard there was a problem with the wedding and wanted to make one thing clear. Sophie had told him I knew they had been in occasional contact again. He believed she and I had moved past the old situation. He said he would not have accepted an invitation to our wedding if he had known she was keeping their contact from me. He also said, "I'm not trying to make myself the good guy here. I should have checked. I didn't." That sounded more believable to me than an apology would have. I replied with one question. "Did she ever tell you I asked for no contact after what happened?" He answered a few minutes later. "Yes. She said that was years ago, and you two were okay now." I put the phone down. I did not suddenly trust Luke. I did not need to. His version independently matched Holly's assumption. Sophie had told at least 2 people that I knew. That gave me the answer Mara's question had not. I went home around midday. Sophie was sitting on the couch when I walked in. She stood up immediately. "Can we please talk like adults now?" she asked. I put my bag down. "Yes." She started by saying she had barely slept and that she did not want one bad weekend to destroy 6 years. I said, "The wedding is off." She stared at me. "For now?" "No." "You mean postpone?" "No. I'm ending the engagement." Her face changed in a way I still hate to remember. She said, "You cannot be serious." "I am." "You're throwing away 6 years over coffee." "No." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm ending this because you decided my answer didn't count unless it was the one you wanted." She looked at me for a long second. Then she said, "That is such a rigid way to frame this." "Maybe." "You're admitting it." "I'm admitting we may completely disagree about whether the old boundary should still exist." "Exactly." "But you didn't disagree with me. You replaced my answer before I ever gave it. That is not fair. You told Holly I knew. You told Luke I knew." Her expression sharpened. "You talked to Luke?" "He messaged me." "What did he say?" "That you told him I knew you were in contact." She sat back down. I said, "You don't have to convince me the old rule was healthy forever. You were allowed to tell me you couldn't live with it anymore. And what would you have done?" "I don't know." "You would have said no." "Maybe." "Exactly." "No, not exactly. If I said no, then you would get to decide if that was a relationship you still wanted. You didn't get to answer for me just because you expected me to refuse." She started crying then, but quietly. I did not feel vindicated. I wanted to go sit next to her. For 6 years, that had been the automatic response. If Sophie cried, I moved closer. My body still wanted to follow the routine even while I was ending the relationship. Instead, I sat in the chair across from her. She said, "I didn't cheat on you again." "I know that." "You don't know it. You think I did." "I don't." "Then how can this be enough to end everything?" "Because the only reason I could stay after the first time was my belief that you would stop deciding what I needed to know." She covered her face. We talked for another hour, but nothing changed. I made the necessary calls to cancel the wedding. I kept the explanation to immediate family very simple at first. I said there had been a serious breach of trust, and we were ending the engagement. I did not give details. The practical side was miserable, but not dramatic. There were people to notify, plans to stop, things to return, and schedules to untangle. Because the wedding was still 2 months away, the guest list hadn't been completely locked down, but enough people were involved that we couldn't just quietly disappear and deal with it later. Sophie and I agreed that personal belongings would be exchanged without turning them into leverage. That sounds obvious, but I'm mentioning it because breakups after long relationships can become strangely petty over ordinary objects. We did not do that. If something was clearly hers, she took it. If something was mine, I kept it. Shared household items were handled with short conversations neither of us wanted to have. The first night I was back home without her, I found one of her hair ties near the sink and put it on the counter out of habit. Then I remembered she wouldn't be coming back for it. The social fallout got worse the next day. I received a message from one of Sophie's relatives that said, "I know you're hurt, but canceling the wedding because she wanted to invite an old friend seems extreme." I read it twice. Then another person I knew through both of us asked if I had really ended everything because Luke might attend. That was when I understood what Sophie was telling people. Not everyone knew the original affair details. Some knew we had gone through a rough patch years earlier. A smaller number knew she had cheated but didn't know with whom. Sophie's version, as it reached me, sounded like this. Luke was an old boyfriend who had recently drifted back into a shared social circle. Sophie wanted to prove everyone could be adults by inviting him. I became jealous. I had secretly never forgiven her for the past. Then I canceled the wedding to punish her for an old mistake. There was enough truth in it to make it convincing. I was jealous of Luke once. I had been deeply affected by what happened. I did end the engagement after his name came back into our lives. What was missing was the part where Sophie had already resumed contact, hidden it, and told people I had approved. At first, I decided not to respond. I told myself I didn't need to win the breakup. I didn't need to hand out evidence or make sure every cousin and friend knew who had done what. Then the messages kept coming from people who were directly involved in the wedding. Not dozens. It wasn't a harassment campaign, but it was enough that I could see I was being asked to absorb the social consequences of a story I hadn't told. One member of the wedding party asked if I had considered counseling before blowing everything up. An aunt on my side who had only heard a secondhand version called Mara because she was worried I was making a decision out of old resentment. I almost stayed silent anyway. Part of me still felt protective of Sophie. The affair had been one of the most humiliating things she had ever done, and there were people involved in the wedding planning who didn't know the details. If I corrected the story, they would. That was the moral line I wasn't sure about. In the end, I sent one message to the immediate family and wedding party who were already being pulled into competing versions. It was brief. I wrote that the wedding did not end because Sophie suggested inviting an old boyfriend. Luke was the person involved in Sophie's prior infidelity. No contact with him had been an explicit condition of our reconciliation. Sophie had recently resumed contact without telling me, had met him one-on-one, and had told other people that I knew and approved when I did not. I ended with, "I'm not asking anyone to choose sides. I am asking you not to contact me based on a version of events that leaves out why I ended the engagement." I did not send screenshots because there were none I needed to send. I did not describe the original affair in detail. I did not post anything publicly. I did not send the message to unrelated friends. But I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew some people reading it were learning for the first time that Sophie had cheated on me years earlier, and I knew she would experience that as exposure. She called me less than an hour later. "You had no right to tell everyone that." I was sitting on the floor next to a box of things she still needed to pick up. "I didn't tell everyone." "You told my family." "I told the people who were already contacting me about why I ended the wedding." "You told them about Luke." "Yes." "You told them I cheated." "I told them the part of the history that explains why the contact mattered." Her voice rose. "That was private. So was the decision to end my engagement. You were explaining that for me." "I told people you canceled because you couldn't handle Luke being there." "That's true. It's not the whole truth. It's your version." "No. The coffee happened. You met him alone. You told Holly I knew. You told Luke I knew. Those are facts." She went quiet for a second. Then she said, "You wanted to humiliate me." I almost denied it. "That would have been too easy." I said, "I wanted people to stop calling me cruel for something you weren't telling them." "That isn't the same as no." "No." She was silent. I continued, "Part of me wanted them to understand that you lied. I'm not pretending I was emotionally neutral." She said, "Congratulations. They understand." Then she hung up. That call bothered me for days because I still don't think my message was wrong, But I also don't think my motives were perfectly clean. I was defending myself. I was also angry. Those can be true at the same time. A few days later, Sophie asked for one final conversation. She wanted Holly there. I found that odd, but Sophie said Holly could explain that the renewed contact with Luke had been harmless and that the first coffee had been completely normal. I agreed because I did not want the breakup to end with each of us speaking through relatives. We met in a neutral place where we could sit without feeling like one of us had home field advantage. The conversation was uncomfortable before it even began. Sophie started by saying, "I want to establish one thing. There was no second affair." I said, "I agree." She looked thrown off. "You agree?" "Yes. I have not accused you of sleeping with Luke." Holly looked between us. Sophie said, "Then I don't understand why we're here. Because you keep defending yourself against an accusation I'm not making." She leaned forward. "You canceled our wedding because I spoke to him. I canceled because you spoke to him in secret and told people I had agreed to it." Holly finally said, "That part is true." Sophie turned to her. Holly's voice was careful. "You told me Benjamin knew. I told you we were working through it." "No. You said he knew you and Luke had talked again. You said he was past all of that." Sophie looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I told you that because I knew he'd turn it into a whole thing." Holly's expression hardened. "Don't tell me I was supporting you. I was supporting the story you told me. I wasn't asking you to lie for me. You made me part of a lie to him without telling me. That is so dramatic. Nobody lied about an affair because there wasn't one." I said, "This isn't about proving you slept with him." Sophie looked at me again. I kept my voice low because I did not want the conversation to become a competition over who could sound more injured. "It's about you deciding you could give my consent on my behalf." Sophie said, "I knew you would never say yes." "Then you knew the answer." "I knew your automatic answer. You don't get a second vote because you dislike my first one." She closed her eyes. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You still think this is a vote where you get veto power over someone in my life forever." I said, "If that boundary no longer worked for you, you could have rejected it. And lose you. Maybe. So what kind of choice is that? A real one?" "That's easy for you to say. You weren't the one living under the rule." "No, I was the one who stayed because of it." Holly looked uncomfortable enough that I nearly suggested she leave, but then Sophie said something that made the whole conversation finally honest. "I knew if I came to you first and said I wanted to talk to Luke, you would shut it down. So yes, I wanted you to see that nothing happened. I wanted it to become normal before you could make it impossible." There it was. Not another affair. Not a secret plan to leave me for Luke. A strategy. She had wanted reality to get ahead of the conversation. Once she had seen Luke in a group and nothing happened, then responded to a message and nothing happened, then had coffee alone and nothing happened, the old boundary would look unreasonable. If I later accepted him at the wedding, the secret contact would become part of a new normal we could pretend we had created together. If I objected, she could point to the harmless meetings as proof that my fear was outdated. I said, "You wanted to make the decision expensive for me after you had already made it. That's not fair. It's what you just described. I was trying to get us unstuck. Without me." She shook her head. "You keep making consent sound like I needed permission to drink coffee with another adult. You didn't need permission. You needed honesty if you wanted to stay in the relationship we had. That sounds like permission with nicer language." I sat with that for a moment because I could see why she believed it. Then I said, "Maybe from your side it did feel that way. You were allowed to say you wouldn't live with it anymore. And if you said you still required no contact, then we would have had the argument we should have had before you met him. And maybe broken up." "Yes." She looked down at her hands. "That's what I was trying to avoid. I know." It was the first time all evening that I felt we had reached the same set of facts. Not agreement, just the same facts. Holly left before we did. On her way out, she told me she was sorry. I told her, "You didn't cause this." She said, "I still hate that I was the one who told you. You thought I knew." She nodded. Then she looked at Sophie and said, "That's the part I'm mad about." After Holly left, Sophie and I stayed. She asked me to delay the breakup. Not the wedding necessarily. The breakup. She said we could go back to counseling. She said she would stop speaking to Luke again. She said we did not have to decide the rest of our lives because of one terrible week. That offer hit me harder than anything she had said before. Years earlier, she had made almost the same promise, and it had helped save us. For several minutes, I could picture doing it again. Not because the situation was identical. It wasn't. But because I still loved her, and love makes repetition look like possibility if you stare at it long enough. I asked, if Luke had never come up on the guest list, when were you going to tell me you'd already seen him? Sophie opened her mouth, then stopped. I waited. She said, I was going to. When? I don't know. When I could explain it without you immediately thinking the worst. That could mean never. No. Then when? I don't know. That was the answer. Not because I required a date. Because she still believed disclosure depended on predicting whether I would handle it correctly. I remembered something from 3 years earlier. During one of those awful reconciliation conversations, Sophie had promised, no more deciding what you can handle for you. She had said it because she understood that hiding information to protect me was still taking away my ability to choose. I said, that was the promise, Sophie. She looked confused. You weren't supposed to decide for me what I could handle. Neither of us said anything for a while. There was no clever response to it. Eventually, she started crying again. I did too. I still said no. The weeks afterward were messy in ordinary ways. Holly distanced herself from Sophie for a while. I only knew that because Sophie mentioned it once during a logistics conversation, and later Holly sent me a short message saying she felt guilty about the whole thing. I told her again that she had not caused the breakup. Luke also stepped away. He messaged me one final time after Sophie apparently told him the engagement was over. He said he was staying out of it and would not be in contact with her anymore. I did not thank him. I just said, okay. His decision was not about loyalty to me. As far as I could tell, he did not want to be in another situation where one person's partner was being told a different story. Given his role in what happened years earlier, maybe that should have occurred to him sooner. He admitted as much when he first contacted me. Sophie's mother called me once. She said she understood why I had ended the engagement, but she thought I should have kept the old affair private from some of the relatives who had been involved in the wedding. I told her I understood why she felt that way. She asked if I regretted the message. I said, I regret that it became necessary. She said that was not the same as answering. She was right. So I answered. No, I don't regret sending it. I do regret that people learned something Sophie wanted kept private. She said, those two things don't cancel each other out. I agreed. One mutual friend I had known for years told me I had made reconciliation impossible by correcting the story as directly as I did. I said, by the time I sent that message, I wasn't trying to preserve our reconciliation. He told me that sounded cold. Maybe it did. Another friend said ending the engagement made sense, but thought I had done it too quickly. In his view, 6 years together deserved another round of counseling before a final decision. I did not argue much. People kept trying to turn it into a single question. Was I right or wrong? Was the old boundary reasonable or controlling? Was coffee harmless or a betrayal? Was Sophie manipulating me or just panicking because she felt trapped by a rule she no longer accepted? The truth was that several of those questions could have more than one reasonable answer. The one I could not get past was simpler. Sophie had decided the agreement no longer required my participation. That was enough for me. Our practical separation took a little while. There were no dramatic fights over property. We coordinated times for her to collect her things. Once, I packed a box of kitchen items that were mostly hers and automatically wrapped a glass mug she liked in a dish towel, because I knew she would be annoyed if it chipped. After I taped the box shut, I stood there thinking about how absurd it was that I still knew exactly which mug she would care about. She came by later and noticed I had included a charger she thought she had lost months earlier. She said, I've been looking for this. I said, it was behind the nightstand. For a second, we smiled at each other like we used to. Then neither of us knew what to do with that, so she picked up the box and left. That was harder than the arguments. The wedding date came and went. I had already arranged to keep that week free, and I did not suddenly fill it with some revenge trip or dramatic reinvention. I spent part of the time with Mara and part of it alone. Mara made no effort to keep me constantly occupied. At one point she asked if I wanted to go somewhere for lunch. I said no. She said, okay, and left me alone. I appreciated that more than I would have appreciated a pep talk. What surprised me most during that week was how often I reached for my phone to send Sophie something ordinary. A ridiculous photo. A question about whether we still had an item in a closet. A comment about a show we used to watch. For 6 years, she had been the person who received all the small pieces of my day. Ending the engagement removed the crisis. It did not erase that reflex. A few times, I typed half a message and stopped. Once I actually sent one about a package that had arrived for her, then stared at the screen because the conversation looked so painfully normal. She replied, "Thanks. I'll get it tomorrow." That was it. Several weeks later, Sophie sent me a longer message. By then, we had mostly stopped speaking except when we had to. I expected another argument about the boundary. It was different. She said she had been thinking about the first time Luke messaged her after the group coffee. She admitted she should have told me before replying. She admitted she should not have met him alone without telling me. Most importantly, she admitted she had no justification for telling Holly or Luke that I knew. She wrote that she had wanted the no-contact rule to be over so badly that she started behaving as if it were already over. She convinced herself that if nothing bad happened, our relationship would eventually catch up to the version she wanted. That was the most honest explanation she had given me. She also said she still believed I would have refused any conversation about changing the boundary. I read that part several times. Then I replied, "You may be right. I meant it." I had spent weeks thinking about my part in how frozen that issue had become. I had not created regular space to revisit the agreement. I had not asked her if it still felt workable. I had treated the absence of conflict as proof that we had the same understanding. And if Sophie had come to me 6 months earlier and said, "I want Luke back in my social world," there is a very good chance my first answer would have been no. Maybe my second answer too. Maybe we would have ended up breaking up anyway. I told her that. Then I added, but I needed the chance to give that answer myself. She wrote back that she understood. I do not know if she fully agreed. That was no longer something I needed to solve. We did not get back together. The final wedding reminder stayed on my calendar longer than I expected. It was one of those small automated things I kept dismissing instead of deleting. I would see it and swipe it away because deleting it felt oddly more deliberate than ending the engagement had. One evening, several weeks after the date had passed, it appeared again as an old event. I opened it. There were notes attached from months of planning. Names, small tasks, things that had once felt urgent. I deleted the reminder. Earlier, Sophie had said inviting Luke would prove we were healed. For a long time, I had believed healing meant the same thing in a different form. I thought it meant we had reached a point where the affair barely needed to be discussed because it no longer controlled us. What I understand now is that silence can also mean two people have stopped checking if they still agree. Sophie was allowed to want a different relationship than the one we had rebuilt. I was allowed to say I could not marry her on terms that had been changed without me. I still miss her sometimes. That does not change the answer I gave. If you like the stories, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.